Welcome to Turn Back the Clock. I was thinking about the schools in Nelson, how blessed we are with such good schools, both private and public. And I thought today I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of our early schools. You know, in 1891, when Reverend Rogers came here for the Presbyterian Church, he was pretty shocked. He'd been a student from Eastern Canada, and when he came to this new little mining company town, he saw children wandering around the streets, and when he asked about school, he was told there wasn't a school. He looked at the town and he realized it was very prosperous. There were a lot of hotels, a lot of bars, a lot of other stores and things, but no school. So he went to a few of the city fathers and he said, look, I'd be willing to teach half days if you people will put up a school. Well, he didn't get too much support. So then he thought, well, maybe I should get a little competition going here. So he went to visit two of the local lumber yards, and he said to one, if you'll donate half the lumber for us to put up a school, then I'm going to get the other lumber company to put up the other half of the lumber. And they said, okay, we'll do that. So he had the lumber. Then he needed the volunteers. And one day he talked to a group of men who were working on some buildings down at the CPR flats, and he said to them, you know, we need that school built. We've got the lumber, we've got the spot. And they said, okay, we'll volunteer. So they put in a few days' work and they put up a school, and it was on the site of the addition to the Bank of Montreal, behind the Bank of Montreal there. Now, he didn't have just the school building in mind. He also had some kind of a community church building in mind. And he and the Methodist minister, Reverend Turner, shared the building for services, and during the week it was used as a school. So this was the humble beginning of our first school. Meanwhile, Dr. Arthur, one of our more educated early pioneers, had been working towards the idea of a school in the community. And he had written letters to the government as well and said we need a government-sponsored, funded school in Nelson. While they were waiting for the government to come through with it, he gave a room in the top of his house. And it's quite a laugh when you think of the amount of equipment that schools have today with computers and all the sports equipment and all the libraries and everything, to read the list of what they had in that first school. 3 9-foot benches and tables, a blackboard, a map, a stove, and a water pail and cup. The next year they added a broom, a water pail and cup, another one, a school bell for 75 cents, a box of chalk, and a bottle of ink. No paper, of course, because in those days students used slates, and I guess whatever books the students bought themselves and brought them, or the teacher had her own. So it was very simple, very meager, but it was a start in education. That government funding did come through. A teacher named Miss Jenny Rath was hired, and the school started. Then they started a school board in June 1892. And the school board decided they needed a better school building. There was some problem about the ownership of the actual building where the school was, of the land. And a trade was made with the Presbyterian Church, and they were given the site that they now have for their church, and the building, that building that they had been using for a church and school, went on to be used as a Boer War recruiting center and a general gathering place, but it was no longer used as either a church or a school. The land where Central School is today was obtained from the government, and a school was put up, a simple wooden school. And with a few additions over the years, that school became Central School, and finally was replaced by the brick structure. But that's a long time in the future. Meanwhile, there was a lot of growing pains. The population of Nelson was becoming more and more full more and more children. Money was always tight. It was we talk about red tape today. It was red tape like mad in those days. You had to write to Victoria and request everything and then wait for an answer. You had to put out the money and get reimbursed by the government. So of course it was just a terrible business, really difficult to deal with. And so as a result, the poor school board never knew whether they were going to be able to build onto the school to provide to the students. And there were times when the school was spread all over town. There were rooms in the, what's now Dr. Bickerton's office on the old IOOF hall on the corner of Baker and Kootenai. There were at one time 2 floors of that were used as a school. The Salvation Army barracks were used as a school. The Baptist church basement was used for a school. And the poor school board was just scrambling, and students were all over town, and you can imagine what it was like for the teachers. But they went on, and in those days, of course, your classrooms were much larger classes, much more many grades and so forth like that. So the teachers really had quite a challenge, as well as with this, being way all over the town. Discipline was an interesting situation, because one of the early requests that one of the teachers wanted was a platform and a chair and table to sit up on the platform. And this was so the teacher could keep their eye, maybe she was really short or something, so she could keep her eye on the children at the back of the school. A few years later, those were gotten rid of by another teacher. Maybe he was tall. We don't know. Among those early teachers was Miss Stella Kane, who was the sister of the 2 Kane brothers who were founders of Kaslo, David and George. One was the early mayor. They were very involved. And another very good early teacher was Miss Nell Delmage, who was Dr. Arthur and Mrs. Dr. Arthur, his wife's sister, who was a fine teacher in herself. The first principal that we had, because as soon as you had a certain number of rooms, then you had a principal, was a Mr. J.R. Green. Well, finally, this whole business of writing to Victoria and writing back and everything was getting really bad. And they really needed a high school. All these students who had grown up through the early 90s were all of high school age, and they needed a high school. And the school board approached the city of Nelson and said, look, would you apply to the government to take over the schools within the city? And they agreed, and they applied, and they took over the schools. And so the school management was settled in town for the first time. They didn't have to do all this dealing with Victoria, or certainly not as much as they had in the past. And in 1902, this all went through, and at the same time, finally a high school was built in town. And that was on the site of South Nelson School, where South Nelson is now. And it was actually our first really substantial brick veneered building. The site up there had a creek running through it in the past. If you look at the old maps of Nelson, there's a creek running through. And even in my day when I was there in high school, there was a swamp out the back of the school. But that's all being diverted now and put into pipes and drained away, and the South Nelson school grounds are very organized and attractive now. But in many years it was a much more wild-looking site with, I can remember, buttercups and things on the school ground. The school district at that time that was under the school board did not include Fairview, because Fairview was not in the city limits. So Hume School, meanwhile, had started its own school, a wooden school, up high on near Douglas Road, View Street area. And then in 1896 came down to the site where Hume School is now, with a wooden school that served with a number of additions, as they all did, and then was finally replaced by a brick structure in 1923. Hume School has had its problems over the years. I think almost the first day it opened, it was struck by lightning. And then later, and it burned, and then later, of course, it went through a fire that was caused it to have to be rebuilt, as did Trafalgar too. Okay, so we've got children all over town. We've got the school board in control. They do have a good site of land there where Central School is today. And finally, a bylaw passed to build a proper school, and a very handsome brick school was put up in 1908. The cornerstone was laid by the Masonic Lodge, who laid cornerstones in a number of our good buildings in town. And it was built, and it was built as a fine, solid school, which it still is today, and very handsome and attractive school. And people really were proud of what they called the Nelson Public School. Sometime in the mid-20s it changed to Central School because of the other schools in the district. It's quite interesting how they recycled buildings in those days. When they built the new Central School, they divided the old Central School into 3 sections. One section, the 2-story section, they kept. They put brick veneer on the outside of it to match the school and kept it until they tore it down to build the present gym. One section went up the street beside the Cathedral of Mary Immaculate and became the Catholic Hall, and stayed there and was used until the present St. Joseph's School was built. Another section was taken down to the 100 block of Baker Street and was used as homes. So they really did reuse and recycle in those days, buildings as well as anything else. Makes you think that they must have been really easily moved and lightweight and didn't involve as much plastering and so forth as today. Well, the high school, Central School, Hume School in Fairview, little country schools out in the outlying areas like Blewett, which was called Belford, Willow Point, Proctor, yes. But the main schools in town were growing, were filling, and in the early 30s, late 20s and early 30s, they realized they needed another school for the secondary age group. And so they put up what is now Trafalgar School, which was called in those days the Nelson Junior High School. On the site it is now, and many Nelson residents were the first classes in that school, which contained shops and home ec rooms and art rooms, and was a very forward-looking school in its day. The old high school, built in 1901-2, was really coming to an end when I was in high school. It was just bursting at the seams. It was very difficult to get around in. The gymnasium was on the top floor with pillars in it, and the school was just totally inadequate. So the school board put a bylaw to the citizens of Nelson for a new high school. And the site where L.V. Rogers is today was purchased, and as the bylaw passed in 1956, the new L.V. Rogers High School was opened. The old high school was remodeled and became South Nelson School. It opened in 1958, and then was there was a fire in 1959, and it was replaced and remodeled and rebuilt on a lot of the old foundations in 1961. The high school has served well, as we all know, but certainly is needing renovations, which hopefully will be happening in the new year. The older people like me think of it as the newest school, but of course it's not. Outlying areas were served by Rosemont received its school in '63. The replacement of the old Blewett School that had been built in 1911 happened in 1967. And then A.I. Collinson and Redfish and North Shore schools all were built in the other time. since then up till today. Our schools have been serving our students very well. Styles of teaching, styles of classes, sizes of classes have certainly always changed. Students have traditionally loved their teachers and had fond memories of school, and I think we're all very attached to our memories of our schools. This has just been a brief look at some of our schools and the history of our schools in the town. And I'm sure there's a whole nother story about the teachers, about the students, about some of the activities and happenings, but I just thought maybe this would start a few memories rolling. See you next time.